Isaiah chapter 3 verse 8. For Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenance does witness against them, and they declare their sin is Sodom, they hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil to themselves. Say you to the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hand shall be given him. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they which lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your paths. The Lord stands up to plead and stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people and the princes of it. For you have eaten up the vineyard, the spoil of the poor is in your houses. What mean ye that you beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, saith the Lord God of hosts? Moreover the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet. Therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. In that day the Lord will take away the bravery of their tinkling ornaments about their feet, and their culls and their round tires like the moon. The chains and the bracelets and the mufflers, the bonnets and the ornaments of the legs and the headbands and the tablets and the earrings, the rings and nose jewels, the changeable suits of apparel and the mantles and the wimples and the crisping pins, the glasses and the fine linen and the hoods and the veils. And it shall come to pass that instead of sweet smell there shall be stink, and instead of a girdle, a rent, and instead of well-set hair, baldness, and instead of a stomacher, a girding of sackcloth, and burning instead of beauty. Thy men shall fall by the sword, and thy mighty in the war. And her gates shall lament and mourn, and she, being desolate, shall sit upon the ground. John Calvin's commentary, for Jerusalem is ruined. Lest it should be thought that God is excessively cruel when he punishes his people with such severity, the prophet here explains briefly the reason of the calamity, as if he had said that the destruction of that ungodly people is righteous, because in so many ways they have persisted in provoking God. And thus he cuts off all ground of complaint. For we know with what insolent fury the world breaks out when it is chastised with more than ordinary severity. He says that they were ready, both by words and by actions, to commit every kind of crimes. And speaking of their destruction, he employs such language as if it had already taken place, though the past may be taken for the future, as in many other passages, to provoke the eyes of its glory. This mode of expression aggravates the crime, as denotes that they had intentionally resolved to insult God. For these things which are done before our eyes, if they are displeasing to us, are the more offensive. It is true that wicked men mock God as if they were able to deceive him, but as nothing, however it may be concealed, escapes his view. Isaiah brings it as a reproach against them, that they openly and shamelessly in his very presence indulge in the commission of crimes. The word glory also deserves our attention, for it is a proof of extraordinary madness, if we have no feeling of reverence when the majesty of God is presented to our view. If God had so illustriously displayed his glory before the nation of Israel, that they ought justly to have been humbled, if they had any remains of shame or of modesty, whatever then may be the murmurings of wicked men against God, or their complaints of his severity, the cause of all the calamities which they endure will be found to be in their own hands. Verse 9, the proof of their countenance will answer in them, or will answer against them, as a prophet had to do with impudent and brazen-faced hypocrites, who impudently boasted that they were good men. So he says that their countenance testifies what kind of persons they are, and that it will not be necessary to bring witnesses from a distance in order to prove their wickedness. For to answer means to bear testimony, or to confess. Although therefore they disguise their face and countenance so that they frequently deceive others, yet God compels them to show and prove what they are, so that in spite of themselves they carry as it were in their forehead a mark of their deceit and hypocrisy. Some explain it that their crimes are so manifest that they cannot avoid seeing as in a mirror the baseness which they desire to conceal. But the former meaning is confirmed by what immediately follows, that they declared their sin in the same manner as the inhabitants of Sodom. By these words he intimates that they devoted themselves to iniquity in such a manner that they boasted of their transgressions without any shame, as if it had been honorable and praiseworthy in them to trample on every distinction between right and wrong, and not to indulge in every kind of wickedness. On this account he compares them to the inhabitants of Sodom, Genesis 18:20, 19 verse 5, who were so much blinded by their lusts that they rushed with brutish stupidity to everything base. So then this is the answer of the countenance which he mentioned a little before, that they carry about with them plain tokens of impiety, which are abundantly sufficient to prove their guilt. Woe unto their soul! Here he declares what was formerly mentioned, that the whole cause of their calamities is to be found in themselves. For by their sins and iniquities they provoke the Lord, and consequently they have no means of evasion, that it is useless to contrive idle pretenses, because the evil itself dwells in their bones, as if he had said, God cannot be accused, as if he punished you unjustly. Acknowledge that it has been done by yourselves, give glory to a righteous judge, and lay the whole blame on yourselves. Verse 10, say, it shall be well with the righteous. Before quoting the opinions of others, I shall point out the true meaning, as punishment so severe commonly present to pious minds an exceeding sharp temptation, and especially since hardly any public calamities occur which do not involve good men along with the bad. So the prophet, at least in my opinion, reminds them of the providence of God which never confounds anything, but even when there is apparent confusion, never ceases to distinguish between good and bad men. But there are various ways in which this passage is explained, for some render it, say to the righteous man, because he is good, therefore he shall eat the fruit of his hands. From that interpretation this meaning is obtained, I wish and command the godly to be of good cheer. For with whatever severity I may punish the crimes of the nation, still it shall be well with the godly. But a more suitable meaning is this, say, that is, hold it to be a settled point. For in Scripture to say often means to think and to be convinced, as David writes. I said I will take heed to thy way, Psalm 39:1, and in 1,000 instances of the same kind, so that he does not bid them tell the righteous man, but he bids every man to be fully convinced that happy will be the condition of the righteous man, though he may only appear to be unhappy. Verse 11, woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him. He brings forward this clause as a contrast to the former one, from which it may be easily inferred what was the design of the prophet, namely to comfort the godly, and to terrify the wicked by the judgment of God. For when an uncommonly severe calamity occurs, which attacks all without discrimination, We doubt whether it be by the providence of God, or on the contrary by blind chance that the world is governed. On this account godly men fear and dread that the same destruction which overtakes the wicked will ruin them also. Others think that it is of no importance whether a man be good or bad when they see both classes visited by pestilence, war, famine, and other calamities, and hence arises a wicked thought that there is no difference between the rewards of the good and of the bad, and in the midst of these gloomy thoughts carnal appetites lead many to despair. Accordingly, the prophet shows that the judgment of God is right, that men may continue to fear God, and may be aware that those who, in the expectation of escape of punishment, provoke God, and will not pass unpunished. He likewise exhorts them to ascribe to God the praise of justice, as if he had said, think not that blind chance rules in the world, or that God punishes with blind violence, and without any regard to justice. Hold it as a principle fully settled in your minds, that it shall be well with the righteous man, for God will repay him what he has promised, and will not disappoint him of his hope. On the other hand, believe that the condition of the wicked man will be most wretched, for he brings on himself the evil which must at length fall on his head. By these words a prophet at the same time charges the people with stupidity in not perceiving the judgment of God, for they suffer the punishments of their crimes, and yet harden themselves under them, as if they had been altogether devoid of feeling. Now there cannot befall us anything worse than that we should be hardened against chastisements, and not perceive that God chastises us. When we labor under such stupidity, our case is almost hopeless. Verse 12. The oppressors of any people are children. Here also is reproved the madness and sottishness of the people, because they shut their eyes at noonday. There is nothing which men are more reluctant to allow than to have a yoke laid on them, nor do they willingly submit to be governed by nobles. Feeble and cowardly, therefore, must be the minds of those who obey delicate and effeminate men, and permit themselves to be oppressed by them. Nor can it be doubted that God has struck with a spirit of cowardice those who offer their shoulders, like asses, to bear burdens. The power of a tyrant must indeed be endured, even by men of courage. But the reproach which Isaiah brings against the Jews is that while they obstinately shake off the yoke of God, they are ready to yield abject submission to men and to perform any services, however shameful or degrading. For the Jews could not complain that they were compelled by violence, when of their own accord they obeyed those whose authority they would gladly have declined. So it is evident that they were struck by the hand of God, and were shaken with terror, so that they had no strength either of body or of mind. This is also the vengeance which God had formerly threatened by Moses. For the general doctrine of Moses, as we have already said, is continually alluded to by the prophets. Or how is it possible that men who had the power of resistance should, of their own accord, undergo a slavery from which they would willingly have escaped, had not God deprived them of understanding and forethought, that he might in this manner take vengeance on their crimes? Whenever, therefore, anything of this kind shall befall us, let us not imagine that it came by chance. On the contrary, whenever it shall happen that we are governed by men who are of no estimation, and which are more insignificant than children, let us acknowledge the wrath of the Lord, if we do not choose that the prophet shall charge us with the grossest stupidity. They who govern thee, he continues to teach the same doctrine, that when God lets loose the reins against the wicked, so as to disturb everything, he shows that he is highly offended at the Jews. For if they had enjoyed his favor, there was reason to hope that his government would be most holy and blessed. At the same time, it is probable that the common herd of men were so foolishly devoted to their rulers that they revered as oracles both their injunctions and their conduct, and hence arose all the corruption that everywhere prevailed. Since, therefore, the contagion was spreading further without being perceived by the people, Isaiah cries aloud that they ought to guard against the governors themselves who corrupt and destroy the people. Others explain this passage, they who bless you, but as the principle which he employs may be taken from Yashur, which signifies to rule, I shall rather adopt that interpretation, for it is more agreeable to the context. I acknowledge that the false prophets flattered the people, but I see no reason why their flattery should be mentioned here. But it applies very well to the rulers and heads that they were the cause of the destruction. For as princes are raised to their office, for the sake of the public safety, so no plague is more destructive than when they are bad men and rule according to their own caprice. He says, therefore, that they who rule are the causes of the evils, and that they corrupt everything, since it was their duty to correct other men and to point out the way by their own example. Verse 13. Jehovah stands up to plead. So long as wickedness rages without control, and the Lord sends no relief from on high, we think that he is idle and has forgotten his duty. More especially when the nobles themselves are spared. He appears to grant them liberty to commit sin, as if they were most sacred persons that must not be touched. Accordingly, after having complained of the princes, he adds that the Lord will do what his authority demands, and will not permit such flagrant crimes to pass unpunished. For there is hardly any conduct more offensive or more fitted to disturb our minds than when the worst examples of every sort are publicly exhibited by magistrates, while no man utters a syllable against them, but almost all give their approbation. We ask then, where is God, whose glory, a great part of which consisting in authority, is taken away, ought to have been illustriously displayed by men of that rank? Isaiah meets this difficulty by saying, though the nation is wicked, yet because the princes themselves are very greatly corrupted, and even pollute the whole nation by their vices, God sits as a judge in heaven and will at length call them to account, and assign to everyone his reward. Although he does not exempt the multitude from guilt, yet that the sources of the evils may be known, he particularly attacks the rulers and threatens them with the punishment which they deserved. Verse 14. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of his people. Formerly he had erected for God a throne from which he might plead. Now he says that he will enter into judgment. How? With the ancients. There might have been a slight allusion to lawful assemblies in which older men sit as God's deputies, but I assent to the opinion more commonly entertained that God contends against the ancients of his people. This passage therefore corresponds to the saying of David, God will stand in the assembly of the gods, Psalm 82, verse 1. That is, though it may now be thought that princes do everything with impunity, and though there be no one to restrain their caprice and their lawless passions, yet one day they will feel that God is above them and will render an account to him of all their actions. These reproofs, undoubtedly, the judges of that time were very unwilling to hear. They have no wish and do not think that it is right that anyone should treat them with such sharpness and severity, for they wish that everything should be at their disposal, that their will should be held as a law, and that they should be allowed to do whatever they choose, that all men ought to flatter and applaud them, and to approve their very worst actions. They think that no man is a judge of their actions, and do not yield subjection to God himself. Since therefore they are so unbridled that they neither endure any advices nor any threatenings, the prophet summons them to the judgment seat of God. Verse 15, what mean ye that ye beat my people to pieces? He mentions also other particulars from which it is evident they ruled in a haughty, cruel, and oppressive manner. It was not necessary that the prophet should describe minutely everything deserving reproof in the princes, for from these few circumstances is it evident with what injustice and cruelty and tyranny they ruled. But to whom shall the poor betake themselves but to the magistrate, who ought to be the father of his country and the protector of the wretched? On this account he employs a vehement interrogation. What? As if he had said, what effrontery is this? What cruelty and barbarity to abuse the main condition of the poor, so as to have no compassion on them. By two comparisons he describes their cruel oppression mingled with pride. Saith the Lord Jehovah of hosts, that the reproof may have all the weight that it ought to have, he brings forward God as speaking. For there is an implied contrast that these things should not be viewed as coming from the mouth of men, but that the accusation proceeds from God himself, and that he pursues those who are guilty of such injustice, and will at length take vengeance on them. Because those who have been exalted to any kind of honor conduct themselves so haughtily as to disdain every direction and advice, he therefore meets their pride by bringing forward the majesty of God, that they may not venture to despise his earnest and severe threatenings. Yet let us remember that this passage ought not to be understood as if the prophet were speaking only about the mercy of God. For after having threatened vengeance indiscriminately on all, he particularly mentions those who are their heads, in order to show that no man can escape the arm of God. And here he employs what is called the argument from the greater to the less. How would the Lord spare the lowest of the people when he punishes, even the princes themselves, because they have destroyed the vineyard? Verse 16, because the daughters of Zion are haughty. Next follows another threatening against the ambition, luxury, and pride of women. On these points the prophet has not followed an exact order, but reproves, sometimes with one vice and sometimes another, as the subject appears to require, and afterwards sums up what he has said in a few words, as he did in the 7th verse of the 1st chapter. He therefore pronounces censure on gorgeous robes and superfluous ornaments, which are undoubted proofs of vanity and ostentation. Wherever dress and splendor are carried to excess, there is evidence of ambition, and many vices are usually connected with it. For whence comes luxury in men and women but from pride? And they walk with stretched forth neck. First, then, he justly declares pride to be the source of the evil, and points it out by the sign, that is, by their gait, that the women walk with stretched forth neck. For as it is a sign of modesty to have a downcast look, as even heathen writers have declared, so to have excessively holy looks is a sign of insolence, and when a woman lifts up her head it can betoken nothing but pride. The prophet certainly acts wisely in beginning at the very fountain. For if he had begun by mentioning signs such as dress, gait, and matters of that sort, it might have been easy to reply that still the mind was pure and upright, and that if their dress was somewhat too elegant and splendid, that was not a sufficient reason for approaching them with such bitter language, and summoning them to the judgment seat of God. Accordingly, in order to meet their unfounded accusations, he lays open the inward disease, which is manifested in the whole of their outward dress. And wandering eyes. What he adds about wandering eyes denotes shameless lust, which for the most part is expressed by the eyes. For unchaste eyes are the heralds of an unchaste heart. But the eyes of a chaste woman are sedate and not wandering or unsteady. and make a tinkling with their feet. This is a part of the indecent gesture by which wantonness is discovered. But it is not easy to say whether the women wore on their sandals some tinkling ornaments which made a noise as they walked, or whether they imitated the dancing women by a measured step, for the form of dresses since that time has been greatly changed. Yet I readily adopt the interpretation that they made a noise in walking, for this is very plainly expressed by the word employed. Verse 17, therefore will the Lord make bald the crown of the head. Here the particle va, which signifies and, is put for therefore, for he threatens that, since neither gentle advices nor any words can reform them, the Lord will deal with them in a very different manner, and will not only employ sharp and severe language, but will advance in dreadful array with an armed band to take vengeance, accordingly as they had manifested their obstinacy from head to foot. So it declares that the Lord will exhibit the marks of his vengeance in every part of their body. He therefore begins with the head, where ornament is chiefly bestowed, and afterwards takes notice of the other parts. It is worthy of notice that the prophet had good reason for reproving, with so great earnestness and vehemence, the luxury of women. For while they are chargeable with many vices, they are most of all inflamed with mad eagerness to have fine clothes. Covetous as they naturally are, still they spare no expense for dressing in a showy manner, and even use spare diet, and deprive themselves of what nature requires, that their clothes may be more costly and elegant. So grievously are they corrupted by this vice that it goes beyond every other. History tells us what vast crowds of women brought together on account of the opium law, which some wished to maintain and others to repeal, and that transaction was not conducted with any gravity or moderation in consequence of the crowds of women. But we need not go far to find examples, for they are innumerable in almost every nation, and it is a vice which has been very common in every age. As we are dexterous and sharp-sighted in contriving apologies for defending our luxury and extravagance, the prophet on that account has pointed his finger at the source of all the evils, namely, that mad ambition by which men are hurried along to obtain public notice, and to arrive at eminence above others. For in order that they may be better known, they wish to outshine their neighbors by the elegance of their dress, that they may draw the eyes of others upon them. Having pointed to the source of the evil, the prophet descends to many particulars for the purpose of bringing to public view the fooleries of women, and enumerates a long catalogue of them to show that, in gathering them together, nothing can exceed the curiosity which dwells in woman. Indeed, there is no end to those contrivances, and it was not without reason that the ancients called the collection of a woman's ornaments a world. For if they were collected into one heap, they would be almost as numerous as the parts of the world. On this account, the prophet appears to search the women's chests, and to bring into public view the gaudy trifles which they have treasured up in them, that their extravagant delight in boasting of these things may render their idleness and folly more evident to all. There is no superfluity, therefore, in this enumeration, though spread out in many words, by which their lawless desires are proved to be insatiable. As to the particulars, I shall not stay to explain them, especially as the best Hebrew scholars have doubts about some of them, and cannot distinguish with certainty the forms of those ornaments. It is enough if we understand the general import and design of the prophet, namely, that he heaps up and enumerates these trifles in order that the prodigious variety of them may disclose their luxury and ambition, so as to leave them without any excuse. It would be the height of impudence to allege that the contrivances made by the childish vanity of women, beyond what nature requires, are necessary for protecting the body. How many things are here enumerated which are not demanded by nature or necessity or propriety? What is the use of chains, bracelets, earrings, and other things of the same sort? Hence it is plain enough that a superfluous collection of such ornaments admits of no excuse, that it gives evidence of excessive luxury which ought to be suppressed or restrained, and that frequently they are unchaste contrivances for weakening the mind and exciting lust. We need not wonder, therefore, that the prophet speaks so sharply and threatens severe punishments against this vice. Verse 24. Instead of a sweet smell, there shall be stink. It is evident that the country here described abounds in aromatic herbs, and there is no reason to doubt that in pleasant smells, as well as in other manners, they were luxurious. We see that those nations which are furthest removed from the East are not prevented either by distance or by expense from indulging in that kind of luxury. What may be expected to happen in those places where they are abundant? That they will excite lust and promote luxury is beyond all doubt. He means, therefore, that ointments and sweet smells were abused by them in a variety of ways. For the sinful desires of men are ingenious in their contrivances and can never be satisfied. Instead of a girdle, a rent. Others have rendered it a falling off, because the Lord will ungird them. He intends to contrast things which are exceedingly opposite to each other. That as the women formerly were most carefully girt and adorned when they walked, they shall henceforth be torn and naked. He likewise contrasts baldness with curls, because they arrange their hair not in a modest, but in an extravagant fashion. Again, a belt is contrasted with sackcloth. Whether it was a belt or some other kind of binding, it is certain that the prophet meant a girdle, which was held in high estimation. Again, burning is contrasted with beauty, because fashionable ladies hardly venture to expose themselves to the sun's rays, for fear of being sunburned. And he tells us that this will happen to them. In short, both men and women are instructed to make a sober use of the gifts of God, both in food and in clothing, and in the whole conduct of life. For the Lord cannot endure extravagance, and absolutely must inflict severe punishment on account of it, for it cannot be restrained by a lighter chastisement. Verse 25, thy men shall fall by the sword. He directs his discourse to Jerusalem, and to the whole kingdom of Judah, for after having demonstrated that the whole body is infected with a plague, and that no part of it is free from disease, and after leaving not even spared the women, he returns to the general doctrine. It would be improper that more than one husband should be assigned to one woman. Besides, what immediately follows applies exclusively to this nation. He particularly describes the punishment that God will bring down by wars, the whole strength of the people. Verse 26, her gates shall mourn and lament. Hence arises a mourning of the gates, which he threatens will take place when they have met with their calamities, for he means that where there were great crowds and multitudes, nothing but a dismal solitude will be found. We know that at that time public meetings were held at the gates, and therefore as the gates sometimes rejoice at the multitude of citizens, so they are said to mourn on account of their frightful desolation. And yet I do not deny that he compares Jerusalem to a woman who is sad, and who bewails her widowhood. For it was customary with mourners to sit on the ground, as that nation was in the habit of using ceremonies and outward signs to a greater degree than would be consistent with our customs. But the sum of the matter is that the city will have lost her inhabitants.